So here is Peter Singer once more. We originally met Singer during the lessons on Kantianism, and we also saw him during the lessons on utilitarianism. So today we're covering his Famine, Affluence, and Morality. He is one of the most recognizable utilitarian thinkers, and we're going to talk a little bit about what he thinks you should do with your money. So in this paper, he starts with an initial assumption, and I think it's a pretty straightforward assumption. So tell me if you agree with this. Suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care is bad. Typically, when I teach this lesson, people say, yeah, if anything's bad, it's that. Now, we can get into debates as to what bad means. Of course, Singer, being a utilitarian, he just thinks that suffering is bad. That is literally the meaning of moral wrong, right? Suffering, harm, that kind of stuff. And of course, moral goodness comes in the form of pleasure. It's the only intrinsic good, that is to say. So that's how Singer would defend this initial assumption. But even if you have a different conception of what good and bad is, people typically agree that this kind of suffering is bad. So then Singer moves on to his next claim, his central principle. If it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, then we must do it. It would be wrong not to. So typically, I usually press people on this point and I ask, are you sure you agree with this? And at least many people say, no, I definitely agree with that. So once you've agreed to these two principles, Singer does, well, I mean, that's why this paper is it's kind of a famous one. He kind of pulls one on you. Singer notes that if you accept his principle, more is morally required of you than you think. This is because the principle makes no exceptions for issues of proximity or for cases when there are others who can help. So what does this mean? He says, well, you should spend your money on people, right? You should give to charity. But since you didn't object to those, the initial assumption and the central principle, with the way they were presented at least, then you cannot really make excuses or exceptions for people that are not close to you. So not only should you give, but you shouldn't limit yourself to giving locally. You should give globally. So let's go over what he really means here. Why does Singer think proximity doesn't matter? Well, if we accept any principle of impartiality or universalizability or equality or whatever, we cannot discriminate against someone merely because he or she is far away from us or we are far away from him or her. So what Singer is thinking here is the way that basically most ethicists after Immanuel Kant think about morality, right? They basically think that it should be impartial, it should be to the greatest extent universalizable, right? So the idea here is if you think you should help people near you, well then you should also think that you should help people far away from you if you can. You should essentially help everyone that you can help. And given international aid organizations of today, you can help people that are really far away from you. Moreover, now remember we're thinking as utilitarians here, at least that's what Peter Singer is. Most income inequality in the world is accounted for by the difference between nations and not by differences within them. So what does that really mean? Well, we're definitely poor. I am, relative to some of the richest people in my nation, sure. But poor people in other countries are poorer than we are. So they are super poor relative to the rich people in our nations. In other words, the real poorest people on the planet are not the poor people in our nations, but the poor people in poor nations. So if you are, like me, a resident of the United States, even the poorest person here is not as poor as the poor people in poor nations. So that is what Singer is making the case for. And of course, being a consequentialist, if one wants to produce the best consequences, one would donate at the international level. In other words, your dollar has a bigger bang at the international level. It has a greater impact. And of course, utilitarianism is all about good consequences, the best possible consequences, in fact. So you're starting to see where Singer is going with this. Let's continue here. Singer defends the second implication of his principle, that it doesn't make a moral difference that others are able to help, through a thought experiment. So sometimes people say, well, there's other people who can give, why me? Here is the thought experiment that Peter Singer gives. It's called the drowning child thought experiment. And of course, it involves a drowning child. So let me just give you the real quick summary of this. If I'm walking past a shallow pond and I see a child is drowning, I should rescue him, despite that I may, for example, ruin my $200 suit. Now, you can change the commodity there, the suit, for whatever you want. A suit makes sense for me, but if you're into, other things that are worth $200, then imagine it's that you would be ruining instead of your suit. Whatever the case may be, it seems that if you were to run into the situation where you would lose $200, but you would save a life, then forget those $200. The life seems to be worth more than the $200 suit or whatever it may be. So if you are agreeing with Singer on this point, and it doesn't matter that someone else could have rescued the child, if you were there, you should do it. Singer now has you thinking in two different ways. It's okay to spend money to save lives, and you shouldn't be bound by your nation state to limit your charity to just within your borders. So what does that mean? It means this. So to what point does Singer believe you should donate? To the point of marginal utility. So that's a fancy economics term. We won't get into that here. Let's just give you the gist of it. That is, to the point where giving any more would bring harm to yourself and or your dependents. So he really does think you should donate as much as humanly possible. Now, before you attack Singer of being a hypocrite, he does this, right? And he's been doing it for, 50 years now? Whenever he wrote this article, 1971. So it is something that he sticks to, and something that we learned about also in the lesson on utilitarianism called the trolley. So that is what Singer does himself, and he's making the case that you should too. And how would you do this? Well, Singer believes his principle implies that our consumer culture must be, in the very least, diminished greatly, but perhaps even abolished entirely. If you, for example, were to keep track of how much you spend on, say, Starbucks, or buying new shoes, or getting funny t-shirts, or whatever, right? Whatever it is that you like to buy, just imagine if you were to reduce that by 50%. How much a year would you save? Or put another way, how much per year would you be able to donate to charity? So that is Singer's main point here, that you should really change your lifestyle so as to be able to donate more to charity and save lives, literally save lives. Now, we're going to have more to say about how to give and how to make sure that your charity is actually effective later on in this lesson. For now, let's look at objections to Singer. And that should say objections. I'm not sure why it says that, objection. Anyways, so let's do this. Singer can be juxtaposed with a couple of different perspectives, and these other perspectives aren't as, I don't know if I want to say extremist, but they're extremist in their own ways, maybe. So let's just juxtapose them here, and they don't think you should give as much as Singer thinks you should give. Let's say that. So statist views. The statist is kind of like Hobbesian social contract theory. Basically, they think that justice is confined to within the state. In other words, justice literally relies on the state. It is the laws that establish our sense of justice and morality, right? This is typical Hobbes. And I guess the way you would put it to see how this responds to Singer is that for the statists, something like international economic justice, right, which is what Singer is basically making the case for, that doesn't even make sense to a statist, right? Justice is what the state says. So justice between states just isn't a thing, right? So that's the statist perspective. There's also maybe what we might term a nationalist perspective. So that's the case when you believe that your loyalties or your moral commitments are limited to just, home, whatever your nation state is, or sometimes I have it there in quotes because sometimes it's not your nation state, it's just your state. Maybe for me it would just be California. Maybe it would just be Los Angeles. I don't know, right? So different, that's why I don't know if I want to call it nationalist exactly, but they kind of want to stay local as much as possible and to differing degrees. So those are two perspectives that definitely wouldn't be as internationalist as Singer. And given these two perspectives, and then we have names for them now, we can give Singer a name. Singer then can be seen as a cosmopolitan, right? So cosmopolitanism is simply to take everyone's interests equally into account, regardless of state boundaries, right? So these are labels, by the way, that Deborah Satz uses in her chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Practical Ethics. That's from Satz 2010. Anyway, so these labels are hers, but they are pretty useful. I mean, I think cosmopolitanism is a good way to describe Singer because it isn't limited to your country or your countrymen, right? It is everyone you can help, right? Everyone's interests are equal. So if you can help people, you should. So let's look here at responses to these non-cosmopolitan perspectives. The first one is actually against the statist, and it comes from Satz herself, right? So not Singer, but a little more recent. The international realm is not a Hobbesian state of war of all against all, and there is a surprising amount of international cooperation. States ratify treaties, negotiate trade agreements, and engage in joint peacekeeping enterprises. There is also substantial interdependence between states. The internal affairs of many countries are influenced by the policies of other nations, especially their trade policies. Thus, contrary to statist assumptions, very few states are self-sufficient. Most states engage in cooperative relationships with others, relationships that give rise to at least some moral obligations, such as the obligation to not engage in cheating and theft. So Satz here is making the case that the Hobbesian perspective about, kind of international anarchy between states, right, is just not true. We do have moral obligations between states. So that is her case against the statist. What about, you might ask, about the nationalist? Well, Singer himself already talked about this. If we're to take morality, Singer might say, take morality seriously, then it kind of doesn't make sense to say, well, I do have loyalties to poor people, but only my poor people. So we've already covered this in this slide. And I suppose that's a debate that can be had, but at least from the consequentialist perspective, it seems hard to beat Singer on his own terms. We would have a greater impact helping not only the poor locally, but also internationally. As we said, we would have a greater impact helping the poor internationally. So that is at least Singer's response to the nationalist. Now, there are other problems maybe with Singer's argument. So let me give you this little bit. Another common strategy in countering conclusions brought on by thought experiments, which are basically arguments through analogy, is to break the analogy. So maybe there's something wrong with Peter Singer's thought experiment about the drowning child. Travis Timmerman critiques Singer's drowning child thought experiment. So this is from a very short article that Timmerman wrote. I believe it was before 2016, but I found it in a book, an anthology in 2016. So here is Timmerman's main point summarized for you by me. We intuitively agree that we should sacrifice $200 worth of clothing once to save a drowning child. But it's counterintuitive to think that we have to give away all of our expendable income to constantly save children. Okay, so we definitely agree that donating to save once makes sense, right? But do we have to keep donating all the time, basically every paycheck? Timmerman is wondering whether that is the case. So he's definitely okay with donating to an extent, right? He's mostly disagreeing as to how much we have to donate. And why does he conclude this? Well, he thinks that Peter Singer's thought experiment is disanalogous. It doesn't really get you to the conclusion that Singer wants to get you to. So, okay, let's pretend you see the drowning child and you rescue him. Awesome, cool, great job. Jolly good. So then the next day, you ruined your suit, right? So you're going to go buy yourself a brand new suit, and it's going to cost you roughly $200. That suit probably doesn't cost $200, to be honest. That looks like, I don't know, I'd say $2,000 maybe, but then again, I don't know much about suits. So you're going to go buy yourself your suit, but then you see another drowning child. And you say, well, I do have to save this child, so you don't get the suit and you save the drowning child. Again, jolly good. Okay, the next day you're going to go buy yourself a suit for sure now. Oh, wait, you see another drowning child. Okay, well, that's fine. You don't get your suit, you save the drowning child. Excellent. The next day, now you're definitely going to get your suit. Oh, but you see now another drowning child. So you don't get your suit and you save the drowning child. I think you're trying to get the drift, right? Do you have to constantly save the drowning children? Well, it's not clear at this point. Let me just get rid of that, right? So at this point, it's unclear whether you have to continuously do this every day and essentially not live your life the way you normally would. So that's what Timmerman is trying to say here. Travis Timmerman is saying, Peter Singer gives you an example, right, where it's only done once, but then he concludes you should basically do it every day, every time you get a paycheck. So once you make the thought experiment the way Singer's conclusion really is, where every time you get a paycheck you have to give an amount, then that's less convincing. So Timmerman's thought experiment, I will say this, it does seem more fitting. I mean, that is actually what Singer was trying to say, or it's more analogous to what Singer was trying to say. Basically, every time you get a paycheck, a chunk of it goes to international aid. So I think Timmerman is right here, that the original thought experiment was off, and that his version, where it happens every day, that's the correct thought experiment. However, I'm not sure that just because it's very inconvenient, it's enough to overcome Singer's main point. In other words, here's my question. Does it really refute Singer's principle that if it is in your power to prevent something bad from happening, it is wrong to not do so? I know it's kind of uncomfortable, but it still seems like even if I can't get a darn $200 suit, it's still, the suit is not worth more morally than someone's life, no matter how good I look in that suit, right? So that is, even though Timmerman's point I think is a good one, I'm not sure it refutes Singer's principle. I'm not sure it doesn't either, right? So these are good questions to talk about. Now, interestingly enough, I mean, just so that you know, both Singer the older gentleman here, and Timmerman, who I think is my age, they both definitely think that, you know, you should give. That's one thing that they agree on. What they don't agree on is how much you should give. So we're going to talk about that some more right now.